Good afternoon. I'm pleased to welcome you all to our second event of the new year, the year 2016. I would like to acknowledge our sponsors, the UC San Diego Library and Jewish Studies. Oh, there's more people coming in, wonderful. Before I introduce our speaker, Mr. Moselio Schaechter, I would like to draw your attention to our flyers out there. Some of you have already signed up for a lunch seminar with Darcy Burkle on March 3rd. If you want to take a flyer now and think about it, you can email me to confirm, but it's all out there. There's also flyers for the public event on March 2nd, Charlotte Solomon's Interventions, which is going to take place here at the usual time, 5 p.m. on a Wednesday. So now it is my pleasure to introduce somebody who has a very illustrious career. I told Mr. Schaechter that I had some fun looking at his CV. I printed it out, and there were so many wonderful achievements that I just sort of highlighted what seemed the most interesting to me personally, because it would be impossible to go over them all.
Oh, come on, you can try.
Well, that would take half an hour. So, Mr. Schaechter got his MA in bacteriology from the University of Kansas in 1952 and his PhD in microbiology from the University of Pennsylvania in 1954. He did his postdoctoral work in the US Army at Walter Reed Army Institute of Research and at the State Serum Institute of Copenhagen. This was from 1955 to 56. His first job was at the then newly founded medical school at the University of Florida, where he spent 4 years, followed by 33 years at Tufts in Boston. He and his collaborators worked there on a number of issues related to cell growth, growth and cell division. He was also the chair of the Department of Molecular Biology and Microbiology for 23 years. Needless to say, he has published a lot, textbooks, reference books, articles, and you can find all that on the internet. His main honors, and as he notes, some deserved, Tufts University Medical Students Teaching Award was awarded 11 times, and that really pleased me to just hear that somebody was so beloved by his students. 11 times, that's an achievement.
I bribed them.
He was an honorary, or is an honorary member of the Ecuadorian Society for Microbiology, an honorary member of the Spanish Society for Microbiology, the US delegate of the Bacteriology Division, International Union of Microbiological Societies, the scientific advisor for the TV Microbial Literacy Project, and his hobby are wild mushrooms. In 1997, he has written and published a book called In the Company of Mushrooms to show that he takes his hobbies seriously, as he writes on his CV. And it was published by Harvard University Press. If you want to find out more about Moselio Schaechter's amazing achievements, you could go to his blog, which has a delightful name. It's called Small Things Considered. And that's where I got some of the information. So now please join me to welcome Moselio Schaechter.
Thank you. Let's see. So, thank you for coming. I always like an audience. So. I have to explain that I feel a little bit awkward or self-conscious about speaking to a program dedicated to studies of the Holocaust because I was only touched by the Holocaust in a broad sense. I was not a part of the concentration camp story. I left Italy, where I was born, before the Germans had a chance to do that to me. So my story is not the story of the heroic survival of people who managed to make it. Mine is a story of the changes, the influences on your life that come about when you're tossed around a little bit from here to there. So it's a different talk, and I hope you don't mind. I'll start out by telling you, as I just said, I was born in Italy, And my problem started with my name. I'm widely called Elio, which is a common Italian name, but my official name is Moselio. And best I know, I'm the only person with that name because my parents invented it. And why did they invent it? Because for reasons that escape me, they did not like to give me two names, but they wanted me to have a Jewish identity and an Italian identity. And Moses and Elio go together to make Moselio. Now, nobody's ever called me that. So don't try, because I won't respond, okay? I'm Elio. But it tells you that my parents were conflicted, like many Jewish people in Europe and in the United States, about which side to go with. The side of assimilation, and to what extent do you want to assimilate in the local culture, and the side of maintaining a Jewish identity above all. So in the two extremes, there is all kinds of variations, and I'm an example of those variations. So my family came from a shtetl. This is my maternal grandfather, a very distinguished-looking guy, and these are some tombstones that you can find all over Poland. I'll come back to that because at the end of my talk, I'll tell you a little bit about the shtetl they came from. I have a slide which I think is interesting. On your left is my paternal grandmother, on my right, my maternal one. And they represented two cultures. This is a balabosta from a shtetl, and this lady is not. This lady is a Viennese intellectual, sophisticated and elegant. And so this is part of my upbringing. My mother was more influenced, of course, by her mother than she was by her mother-in-law. So it followed that my mother learned. Both my parents went to Vienna during the First World War, because the place in Galicia, in southern Poland where they lived, was the battlefront between Austria and Russia. And so it was time to leave. People went to Vienna and survived the war there. My father eventually went to Italy, as I said, and the reason for that is simply that he was an adventurer. My father did not do what other nice Jewish boys did, namely stay in Vienna, maybe try to go to New York, perhaps Berlin, something like that. That was too conventional for him. Italy was the wilderness. To go to Italy for a young Polish Jew was unthinkable. There were very few Jews in Italy to begin with. They were mostly Sephardim. He was an Ashkenazi, of course. And so he did that with gusto. I mean, he just loved the idea. And eventually asked his aunt in Vienna to find him a girl, and they found my mother, and he brought her to Italy, and the rest is what happened. So here I am, and I'm very cute. So we had, and this shows you the kind of life that I led. It was upper middle class, something like that. And I was dressed elegantly, especially for pictures. And we had a maid. Now I have to tell you a little story about the maid. Being a good Catholic and taking me for walks, she thought nothing of going into the church with me. I don't think my parents would have been delighted with that, but she didn't tell him and I didn't tell him. But one day we come out of the church and lo and behold, my teddy bear is missing. What do you do? So we looked all over, and where did we find it? We found it in the confessional. And I think, that's where I put it, I think that teddy bear had expiated all its sins. It was pure of spirit. Anyhow, so I grew up in that environment, and the environment was not particularly inimical to Jews until about 1938, which is when Mussolini decided that he had to follow the mandates of Hitler and promulgated what I will call racial laws. And I do have the memory of seeing people on the sidewalk getting a newspaper and saying, racial law, ma che legge di razza? What kind of a race is that? They're not yellow, they're not black. What kind of a race is that? So to Italians, that concept that Jews were something that different was alien. And in fact, as you probably know, the Italian Jews of the north, not the ones in Rome, which are the longest continuous community in the world, but the ones in the north, in Turin, Milan, Genoa, Venice, they were a mixture of Ashkenazi and Sephardi. They all became Sephardi, but they were originally from various places. And they were very high class. They were quite assimilated, and their assimilation was very interesting because they had an amazing amount of social conscience. I'll come back to that later in my talk, demonstrating an example of what made these people tick. So anyhow, that is my experience in Italy, and but fascism was the dominant thing, and so, like it or not, I had to be a Balilla. If anybody knows the term, that is like Hitlerjugend in Germany. Balilla were the Mussolini Jugend in Italy. And this says the Balilla policy, and this is really an interesting document. What this is an exhortation here in very nice, simple language to the children saying, please save some money. And you could put in 10 lire, and you had this document. And so you were supposed to put in money and save for your higher education. Kind of strange, but acceptable, I suppose. So I was, in fact, a member of the fascist youth movement for not very long, because eventually, when the racial laws were promulgated, what that meant is that Jews who had been in Italy less than 20 years had to leave. My father had just been there just over 20 years. In addition, they could not have government jobs. So a lot of professors at the university, many of whom were Jews, by the way, in Italy, the achievements of the rather small Jewish community in the north, about 10,000 people, is off scale. There's no other group anywhere which has achieved so much out of such a small number. Jews are pretty good at achieving things, but this is off scale. There are 6 Nobel Prizes in 10,000 people. It's really amazing. Some from the same lab. They learned from Giuseppe Levi in Turin. Anyhow, so I had to go to a Jewish school because I couldn't go to the public school. And here is my diploma. There I am, looking fresh. Pretty cool, right? And this is my diploma from the 2nd grade. And it says Talmud Torah school. And the curious thing is that it has a seal of the king of Italy with a cross and a Magen David. So I have both in one. Anyhow, I was not particularly bothered by what was going on around me because as I say, until things matured, you could live quite comfortably. Let's see, I'm going to show you my class. This is me. So these distinguished-looking people were university professors who had lost a job and went to teach in a school, okay? And they were not shy about expressing their opinion. So in my earliest Latin class, somebody wrote on the board the following: man is a wolf to man. That was said to young children, okay? Anyhow, let me stay with that for a minute. In time, things got a little bit difficult, and we tried to leave. My father was quite aware of what was going on because we had relatives in Vienna, and they kept coming down and kept telling us what was going on in the north. You didn't always know, but Kristallnacht became a very real reality with them, and so they decided to leave. So here are stories that are so weird. My father went to the Australian consulate and got a visa, miraculously, okay? And he had enough money, because he had been a fairly successful businessman, to buy tickets on a ship to Australia. So we go to Genoa, the port city, and they take our luggage up. We walk up the plank, and they said, sorry, you have to go to the office here. And in the office, they said the following: you have a ticket, you have a visa, and you have a valid passport. However, if for reasons that we cannot foresee, the Australians decided not to take you in, your passport would not be valid on the trip back. Nobody could believe that. My wife, who was born in Germany and has a similar history than I, tells an analogous story. They got in Germany a visa, this was earlier, 1938, a visa to Argentina. But they needed a stamp, a special stamp for it. So they went to the Argentinian consulate in Paris, and the Argentinian consulate looked at the paper and ripped it and said, we have enough Jews in Argentina. So not being able to make it meant that we had to live under sort of restricted conditions. At that point, you're not supposed to rent a place, so you rented it through the help of some deserving Gentile who helped us out. This was dangerous in a way, so you had to sort of stay out of sight. The result was my parents spent all the time in this two-room apartment, and other people came early in the morning and left late and played endless games of chess. I mean, this was chess in the morning, chess at noon, chess in the afternoon, endlessly, and then they left and so forth. But one day, my father came and said, I found a consul I could bribe, and it's the consul of Ecuador. And then he says, and I don't know where it is. And I was a bright 12-year-old, and I said, it's on the west coast of South America. And he says, okay, that's where we're going. And Edith, my wife, has exactly the same story in France, in Paris. They went around, they made the rounds, and they found that the Ecuadorian consul would give them a visa. Now, I should explain that Ecuador was, at that time, about as primitive a country as you can find in the Americas. It was very, very underdeveloped. And they had the bright idea that getting Europeans in may help their development, their economy, their well-being as a country. And so they decided to give visas to Jewish people with the proviso that they should go and either work in a farm or build up some industry. Okay. Now, that was probably not unreasonable when you think about it, but it was clear that it was not easy to do either thing, especially farming, because the farming was done by the peons. It was not what you do in Iowa. It was something very, very simple. But so Edith's family and her parents, her brother and uncle, their kids, rented a farm and went and worked in the farm. My father looked at that document on the visa and said, well, forget about it. And that was perfectly reasonable because everybody else forgot about it. I mean, the enforcement of laws was not the high point of Ecuadorian jurisprudence. So, but people who felt honor-bound did that, and they did that rather with a lot of difficulty. It was, Edith should come and give you her talk because it's even more vivid than mine. Okay, so we left Italy in September of 1940. The war had started earlier, but in Italy, it started in, what did I say, in June of 1940. So I remember having to, there was a blackout. We had to close the windows, not use lights, and we had what do you call it? We had alarms because the French were coming and bombing us. So I remember that, but it didn't last very long because soon we left. And as I said, to that point, I had not suffered from lack of food, lack of shelter, lack of comfort. So that's my point. I don't have that kind of a story. But so how do you get from Italy to Ecuador during the war? The answer is with difficulty. So we did it by taking a ship from Genoa to Barcelona, Spain, which is about a two-way trip, and then a train to Portugal, to Lisbon. We made it. On the way back, that ship got sunk by a French torpedo with the loss of our lives. So we made it barely. We went through Madrid. I was very, very eager to see art. I had done that in Milan on my own. And I went to the Prado, and the Prado was closed. Years later, I went again. I was in Madrid. I went to the Prado, and the Prado was closed again. The third time I made it. The trip across Spain was a little bit horrendous because the Civil War had just ended and it was really ruins all over the place. But we made it into Lisbon, and the sight that I remember seeing, we got there at night, was like this, totally lit up. In Italy, there was no light at night, and in Spain, it was sparse because of the Civil War. So I see this, and I say, my goodness, I'm in heaven. I had a small problem. When we got through the border, and I heard people speaking Portuguese, I had a problem. I don't know if you know what Portuguese sounds like, but it does not sound like Spanish, does not sound like Italian. So I said to my father, I think we made a mistake. We went east instead of west. That wasn't the case. Anyhow, we lived in Lisbon for about 4 months. We got a transit visa to the United States, because you had to go through the United States, and waited for a ship. It took about 3 months to do it. And I was treated beautifully. We lived in a pension, a boarding house, and a lot of young single men were living there, and they treated me like their adopted son. They took me to soccer games. They made me read Italian magazines. One of them had a magazine stand, stuff like that. The only problem I had was with a kid my age, a Portuguese boy, because he was absolutely convinced that Christopher Columbus had been Portuguese. And that seemed, okay, I couldn't take that. So, but we spent about 4 months there, and we eventually got a ship to come to America. But, I'd like to read to you a little thing that I wrote many, many years later, if you allow me. This is an experience of joining in what was then Elder Hostel, a Rhodes Scholar program on the Jewish heritage in the Iberian Peninsula. So we went to several small towns, all notable. In each place, we heard lectures by local professors and visited a number of synagogues, juderias, it's a place where Jews used to live, and tourist sites. I found that becoming immersed in matters that happened over 500 years ago is not a predictable endeavor. I was unsure of my reactions to events that occurred so long ago, laden with both misfortunes and happy times. How does one identify with one's predecessors? Never mind that I'm Ashkenazi, I wasn't Sephardi, which is what the people were there. Never mind that. Does one imagine being one of them, garbed in medieval clothes, musing about abstract religious matters, anxious about survival, tormented about conserving the faith? Who would have been? A modest craftsman, an early day professor, perhaps a botanist? Who would I have been? A true believer, an apostate? Would I have been living during one of the better times when the Jews could proudly walk through the narrow streets feeling they truly belong in Sepharad? Sepharad is the name for Spain. Or would I have been, in Portugal by extension, or would I have been cowering in fear from the enemy of the day, the fanatic Muslim or the frenzied Christian, hell-bent on forcibly converting as many of us as possible to the faith? I felt fear in me when we learned that of the hundreds of thousands of Jews who stood at the quay in Lisbon awaiting ships to take them away, when the ships did not arrive, within a few days they were forcibly baptized. 4 centuries and a half later, in 1940, as a 12-year-old, I stood on such a quay with my parents on our way from Italy to Ecuador. Our ship did come. So, how do you get it? Oh, yeah. This is the ship. The magnificent Serpa Pinto, which you cannot read, but that's what it is. Oh, yeah, it says here. Serpa Pinto was a great Portuguese navigator. And this ship was not exactly a luxury ship. It was stacked in the holds, about five stacks of cots. You had to tie yourself in, otherwise you'd fall off. And when we got to New York, the Red Cross took over. So we got into Ellis Island, for 5 days, and Ellis Island felt like heaven. It felt like, my goodness. They have clean sheets, they have clean food, they count you every time you go through a door, but who cares? So it felt pretty good. But then my aunt, who was living in New York, she was living, for those New Yorkers among you, she lived on Ocean Avenue and Church Avenue. Sounds familiar? Okay. She posted a bond, and we could get out of Ellis Island and spend about 3 weeks there. And I had made a beeline for the Metropolitan Museum. That was the first thing I did. Anyhow, we finally got a ship to Ecuador. And so where is Ecuador? And it's here. This is the equator, so it's right at the equator, below Colombia and on top of Peru. Okay? It's a relatively small country. It had at that time about 5 million people, now it has about 15 million people. The capital city is Quito. The main port and site of commerce is Guayaquil. And Ecuador is the jumping off point for the Galapagos, because they own the Galapagos, which are over here someplace, under the E. Okay? So some of you must have been there, and you know what I'm talking about. When you do this, you tend to spend a day or two in Quito, because it's a lovely, lovely, lovely city. It's full of magnificent colonial buildings, and it's on right underneath a very tall mountain, a 16,000-foot mountain. So Ecuador is a mountainous country. This is the Cotopaxi. And to get to Quito, which is where we wanted to live, and most of the Jews who came ended up in Quito, about 3,000. There were only about 300 or so in Guayaquil. And the reason was that Guayaquil was a tropical hellhole at the time. I mean, it was hot, muggy, and full of insects, but full of insects. Quito was at 9,000 feet, although being at the equator, it was really quite comfortable. And one could live a more reasonable life there. So most of the Jews went to Quito. And you went there by a train, because that was the only way to go. There were no flights. And the train, this is a modern version of it, believe it or not. If you notice, it goes down here. But it can't make a curve, can it? So what does it do? It goes down here, around the corner, keeps going, and then reverses direction and goes down here. This is called the devil's nose. It does this 3 times. So it's picturesque. Okay? I don't know who tells the story. I don't think it happened to our family. But there were all kinds of sales, women trying to sell you something, food and so forth, like baked guinea pig, stuff like that, delicacies like that. And one of the things that somebody bought was a whole stalk, a huge stalk of bananas for very little money. They couldn't believe that bananas could be that cheap. Well, it turns out they weren't bananas, they were plantain. You couldn't eat them, not cooking them. So we had a lot to learn. So this is sort of what Ecuador looked like at the time. Very, very simple, primitive country. In here is a group of the Jewish kids, and this is, where are you? This is you, yeah. This is my wife, and these are other friends, and they were taking refuge from the rain. So this is the way it looked, and inside you had mud floor, and the guinea pigs would run around. So it was. Yeah.
May I ask, you went from New York down to Ecuador. How did you get there, since one is in the Atlantic and the other one is in the South?
Through the Panama Canal.
Through the Panama Canal?
Yeah. Yeah, sure. So this is what it looked like. But there were these magnificent churches and cathedrals. So Quito has this spectacular Baroque gold leaf decoration, a major cathedral there, and so forth. The contrast is, of course, stark. How did we make it? So this is what it looked like. Very steep. You can see how steep the streets are and how high up they go up again. And what I want to relate is the feeling that people had who came to Quito in 1938, 1939, 1940, as we did. And it was really like being on the moon. It was really as remote and as distant and as totally strange. They were not there was not in Quito a pre-existing Jewish community, like in Argentina, in Mexico, so that where Jews could come, they could be given some pointers, they could be given some help. In Ecuador, before 1938, there was a small handful of Jews. And there was not a Gehillah, there was not a community. So everybody had to invent a way of life. And this was formidable. It was really demanding and threatening. The result was that, of course, it's understandable that everybody stuck together because they were trying to help each other. So the people who had been there a couple of years earlier became the people who taught those who came later. Okay? And this was pretty much the spirit of the community. It was a very tight community. 3,000 people is not small, but it's not very, very big either. And there was a synagogue, there was a sports center. The sports center, I should tell you a story, that I was maybe 12 years old, and I was boxing with a friend. Don't ask. And my wife, Edith, who was then 8, 7, 12. You were 12? I was 12. Okay, she's 5 years younger than I. Anyhow, she looked at me boxing, and she and the girlfriends were laughing and laughing and laughing. I can imagine. So what did I do? I went over to her, got my hand in the pocket, I took a coin out and says, "Here, when you grow up, call me." What a line, huh? And she did, 40 years later. She stayed in Ecuador, married there. I came to this country, I married. I became widowed. She divorced her husband, and I was in Boston at the time, and we met, and the rest is that part of the history. So, I want to dispel, oopsie, what have I done? Thank you. Now, I want to dispel the impression that this is the way it's now. Very far from it. This is what Quito, Ecuador looks like now. It's amazing. There are high-rise buildings all over the place. The volcano is still there. There is this magnificent office buildings and favelas like going up the mountain. Of course, the higher up on the mountain, the poorer you are. Less convenient. Okay? So today, this is a thriving is wrong. It's not a thriving community. It's a poor country with elements of progress. And the Jews had something to do with it. Why do I say that? Because they started out in a very simple way. This is what they did. They hired a schlepper. They hired somebody who carried goods. No, in this, I don't have a picture of the goods. This is not the goods they carried, but you can see that this is an old story. And they carried this on, they peddled. They went from house to house and said, "Would you like to buy my merchandise? It's on time," which was dangerous because who had the money? And this was very simple. There were people all over the street perfectly willing to do that. But notice, this is a picture from a shtetl in Poland that did the same thing in Poland. So what happened was that slowly, and maybe not so slowly, they made a living. And when they started to make a little better living, they would open a store. And when they opened a store, they made an even better living. And some of them went into making textiles, making some metal work, other kind of industry, fulfilling the requirement that the country of Ecuador had put on some of them. And by and large, they became fairly well off. What happened was that there was not a breakthrough. Oh, I want to show you my father's store. This week he sold sewing machines. The next week he sold coffee. The week after he sold shirts. He sold whatever he saw. He was a seed dealer. You know what a seed dealer is? Somebody who deals with whatever he sees. So that's what he did. And he made something of a living, and other people made a much better living. Schaechter is the closest to Schaechter in Spanish is Chester, so that he called that. Anyhow, so the Jewish people did reasonably well. Some became Ecuadorianized. This is a document that bestows Ecuadorian citizenship to my father. Notice the formidable collection of stamps. So you do it. And we lived. We lived there in relative comfort, some people more than others. Neither Edith nor I belonged to the higher stratum. We had to go to public schools instead of private schools because our parents did not have enough money. But some people did very well. So it was a mixed bag. Some people did better than others. Her parents left the farm eventually and went into some manufacturing. The thing I want to talk about a little bit, I want to stay with it a little bit, is the relationship of the Jewish community to the Ecuadorian society. There was relatively little anti-Semitism. There was some when we first came because the German embassy was very busy, and they promulgated anti-Semitism. But when they left during the war, they were kicked out, that disappeared because the Ecuadorians didn't have a clue. To them, we were gringos. We were blonde, tall, light in complexion. We were not Ecuadorians. So that's what do they know? Everybody's a gringo. So we were gringos. Okay. So our generation was scared. We're scared of living in this strange place, living in this place. Although it was a welcoming place, nothing happened bad. But still, the strangeness was threatening. And so there was relatively little in the way of socializing. And even, I would say, there was a fair amount of sort of a prejudice against the fact that Ecuadorians were poor, many were dirty. About half are native Indian, American Indian. And so they were very poor. They had been slaves to the Spaniards. So that attitude was fairly prevalent. Eventually, it went away because the children of our generation grew up there and they married Ecuadorians and all is well. But at that point, it was really quite distant. And I have to tell you that I felt sufficiently guilty about that because Ecuador had, after all, taken us in, unquestionably saved our lives, and treated us very decently. So why not be nice? And so I had one Ecuadorian friend. This is interesting because among my Jewish friends, I was the only one with an Ecuadorian friend. Okay. This guy went on to do great things. He was he became a pathologist, a very distinguished pathologist, professor at the university and so forth. And we became very, very good friends. But nobody else had an Ecuadorian friend. As I say, a little bit later they did, but not during our phase. So years later, I had sort of an attack of nostalgia, and I wrote to Gallo, and I said, I'm going to come back, and I want to do something, like I'd like to teach a course. Okay? So he set me up to teach a course in molecular biology, which was reasonably well attended. I enjoyed it, and we had a really good time. And I thought that this was really quite something. I'm going to read you something else that happened years later. Years later, I went back to Ecuador. As I say, I went back a number of times. I taught courses. I made it possible for Ecuadorians to come to our institution and stuff like that. But I was asked by a classmate of mine who had become the principal of the high school I had gone to go and talk to the students. So this is what I wrote. I found myself in one of the same classrooms where I had sat all those years before, talking to senior biology majors. I chose as my topic, how does one become a scientist? With a lively discussion that included rather sophisticated questions. The curiosity of the students manifested was highly gratifying, and their insight surprising, given their relative isolation. The gap between us soon vanished, and I found that I was talking with them instead of at them. In addition to rather technical questions, I remember being asked, what does one do in science when one gets scooped? And others published the same result first. Well, how much credit does one give to one's collaborators and so forth? I was duly impressed and pleased that these youngsters were the worthy successors to my generation. I believe that I said as much, rounding up what seemed to be a perfect hour. After I ended the session, two of the students came up and said, this is in Spanish, "Y doctor, ahora qué? Así no más se va?" And doctor, what now? Just like that you're leaving? I could not give him an answer. I felt touched and helpless. I could only retrieve, in vain, fighting back my tears. So I had very rewarding experience with Ecuador. But let's give you a few examples of what happened when you were there. So this is at the equator. Your latitude 000. Turns out it's wrong, but what's a few feet among friends? This is an interesting story. I went to work in an outfit called LIFE, not life, LIFE. What does it stand for? Laboratorios Industriales Farmacéuticos Ecuatorianos. Pharmaceutical industrial labs of Ecuador. And this was run by a group of Italian Jews, back to my origins, who came over and took on this company that had been sent over by the Germans. The Germans had to leave, they left the stuff behind. These Italian people took over and built a very nice company. Eventually, it was bought up by Dow Chemical. So they did very well. And here is the first paper I ever wrote, which is about ringworm of the scalp in the province of Manabi. Okay. So this is my boss, and I acknowledge him because he was such an incredible guy. He made me into the research department of the company. Everything new and different he gave to me to do. Now, so I fast forward, I came to this country, I became a citizen. In the army. I have to tell you, though, that this happened in the morning, and Captain Edgar Snyder had just gotten started, and his breath blew me away. He had been drinking all night, apparently. So I don't know, I look erect there, and he looks erect. I don't know how he did it, but I became a citizen. Okay, now, to go around. A couple of years ago, we were in Eastern Europe, and we went to Poland, and from Krakow is about 2 hours to this town, Tarnobrzeg, which is where my mother's family came from. So I rented a car, I hired a driver, wonderful young Polish guy, who took me around, and we had a great time. Now, I knew that I wouldn't see anything because my family had left during the First World War, so it's 100 years ago. I thought, I'd like to look around. I like the existential experience of being there. And it was nice. So I saw what it looked like. This is the old, and this is the new. A town of about 30,000. And we saw that there was a sanctuary with a Star of David. And my driver was very nice. And I was sort of wandering around figuring out, what is this? When somebody came over and said, look, the lady across the street is the caretaker of this. So this guy goes across the street, walks into her house without knocking, brings her out, babushka and all, and keys. And she opens it up. And so we saw this sanctuary, which looked like this. It had a plaque in Hebrew and some writing in Hebrew and a whole bunch of candles that had been used. And I really don't know more than that. So I had the experience of being there, of being in a place where my mother's family had grown up. And this was a cemetery, which was fenced in, and the lady had the key. And I couldn't believe it. There was a rusty lock, and I thought, no way. And she'd opened. She put the key in, and there it opened. Anyhow, so we went in, looked around, and there was not a great deal to see. That's about it. So now, a lady from our group by the name of Eva Zelig, who's a professional videographer, made a tape which is called An Unknown Country, and it's a magnificent tape. And if you would like to get it, you have to go to her because you cannot buy it. At least I don't know where you can buy it. And I've written some memoirs, and if you'd like to see what I wrote, some of what I read is from there. So you go and just Google Elio's memoirs. Thank you.
So you take questions?
What do you think?
We'll walk around with
Yes, sir.
How old were you
Ecuador, 12 years old and 21 when I left. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Where in Italy were you from?
Milan. I spent Elegante. We spent 7 years, I think, in Milan, then several years in Turin, then went back to Milan. Yeah.
I have two questions. At that time, when you were in Portugal, the 3,000, were they mostly Ashkenazi Jews who had left
Yeah.
because of the Nazis?
Yeah.
And my other question.
There were very few authentic Portuguese Jews. In Spain, there were none.
Right.
So,
But none of the Italian Jews who were Sephardic had come to Portugal.
they left Italy during the war. So I don't know if they went through Portugal or not, but they didn't settle in Portugal.
They didn't.
No,
They weren't
no,
there.
no.
And my other question was, when you were going through the Panama Canal, it was during the war. Do you remember if there were any difficulties, if there were any delays? Because that was completely very well guarded by the
sure.
U.S. government.
I'm sorry, I don't remember. I was
No, I
12 years old and I had other worries. Yes.
Were any of your relatives swept up in the Holocaust and lost their lives? Cousins that were in Vienna, for instance, or back in
Except
Poland?
for a couple of cousins, yes. Unfortunately, what happened to us is that when my father went to Italy, he lost track of a lot of family. So he didn't, I didn't know what happened to a lot of people. But I have a cousin in Israel. My aunt and husband went to Israel. They had 2 children. And I'm a professor of microbiology, and my cousin is a professor of microbiology at Hebrew University. So it must be in the genes. But other than that, I don't have a lot of contact.
I did have one other question.
Sure.
And that was, in your lifetime, did you ever see a German in a Nazi uniform?
No. No.
Basically, you were one step ahead of them the whole
I was
time.
one step ahead of them. I saw fascists in a black shirt. You know, that I did see. And I tell you, my father was probably so careful not to make waves, which is what a lot of Jews do, that he didn't tell me anything about fascism. You know, it just wasn't. Yeah.
What percentage of the young people left Ecuador? Are
Well,
any of them still there?
Most. Very few of the 3, I think the community is now about 300 people, with one odd thing. They have a community center that would do justice to the JCC. It's huge for 300 people. It has 2 sanctuaries, all kinds of activities, areas. It's incredible. But I'm telling you this because what it means is that the people who stayed made a lot of money.
Did your parents die there?
No, they went to Israel, and they died in Israel. Yeah, yeah, yes.
I see that you use a lot of Yiddish expressions. Was Yiddish spoken at home in Ecuador?
Yes, oddly, yes. Here's the problem. In Italy, my parents spoke Italian with me. But then, at the end, I told you we lived in a very constricted area, and they spoke Yiddish among themselves, and I picked up Yiddish. Okay? Then we get to Ecuador, and all my friends are from Central Europe, from Austria, from Germany, Czechoslovakia. They all spoke German. They hadn't learned, not Yiddish. No, they spoke German. No, they didn't speak Yiddish at all. They had not learned Spanish. So here we are. We're going to use Italian? That makes no sense. So we adopted our Yiddish as a family language. And my Yiddish is very Germanized. It's not a very good Yiddish, but I used it for all the time I was at home. Unlike most American Jews of our generation who say, my parents spoke Yiddish to me when they didn't want us to understand. Okay. Polish people, Russian people, French people, German people, all say the same story. Yeah.
There's a question in the back.
So in the communities in Quito, what kind of observances did you have? What kind of practices did you keep in the home? Were there rabbis?
No, there wasn't. Yeah, good question. There was not a rabbi. There was a cantor who thought he was a rabbi. And there was a fairly thriving synagogue. It was on the model of European, you'd call them Orthodox, but here they would be called who knows what. very open to personal interpretation, very Eastern European-like. In other words, it was not orderly. So I went there. I was bar mitzvahed shortly after I got to Ecuador. I was taught by an uncle of Edith's who was German, and it wasn't much of a bar mitzvah, but I had a bar mitzvah, and so the community was active along a bunch of activities. Oh, there's a slide I missed. We had conferences, talks, discussions, all kinds of things like that. There was a guy who would write little funny things, reviews. He would write sort of scenes from Ecuador. They were very funny. And then we had the theater. And the theater was in German. And I played in Candida from George Bernard Shaw, and I played in something else. And I even played, you won't believe this, not only was a play, it was called The Rape of the Sabine Women. It was a comedy, end of the 19th century comedy. And it was not in German, it was in Swabian dialect. And we were supposed to understand that. I mean, this is how, when the Jews came to Ecuador, they brought their culture in a suitcase. They brought it with, they unpacked it, and that's what they had. So they didn't have anything else. They could not import anything else. The jokes we told were the jokes that you told in Vienna or Berlin in 1938. Nothing new. Nothing was possible. So, anybody here from Austria? Okay, no, I won't. I could sing you a little ditty, but it wouldn't make sense. So we had a lot of activities and sports. We had a sport field. Not only was I a great boxer, but also we played basketball. We had running, high jump, long jump, stuff like that. And there were people who were very involved in training the young people. They were very committed to taking care of the young people having an identity. So I would say that worked pretty well.
You've touched on what amazes me about many Europeans, your facility with multiple languages. I was just counting, though, you started with Yiddish and Italian, learned Spanish. When did you pick up your English well enough?
Who says I did? Well, the joke in the family is I speak 4 languages, but English is my best. It's the only language that I have good command on. I've written a whole bunch of books. And it's the one language where I have an accent. In my other languages, I have a local accent, but not a foreign accent. So when you're young, you pick it up.
Did you learn it when you came to the U.S.?
Well, I'll tell you a story. I studied English in high school, but that was like not studying. But I had friends, American friends, who went to this laboratory, came to this laboratory to work, spend the summer there, and so I had to speak English with them. So when I came to this country, I went, as Suzanne said, to the University of Kansas. Doesn't everybody from Ecuador go to the university? Anyhow, so I go there, and of course, I am learning English. And one day I thought, I'm going to show it to this lab mate of mine, a good old boy from the Kansas farm. So I strut in and I say, well, Bill, how's everything? Pretty good, right? And he says, don't know about everything, but I'm fine. So I knew when I was being put down. Yeah.
How primitive it was when you got to Ecuador.
It was plenty. The streets were not paved. The water, there was water coming out of the faucet some of the time. If you threw a switch, the electricity would come on some of the time. Very few cars. It was extraordinarily simple. There were no big stores to speak of. There was no supermarkets. It was all an open market. And the Jews contributed a lot because they brought in a lot of commerce. And so to this day, in fact, there are some major undertakings that are owned by Jewish people. So I think, in fairness, they gave back. They gave back what they got.
What year was it when you arrived in Ecuador?
1940, late 1940. The war started in June. We got there in 1941, January 1941. So, and then I left in 1950 I left.
After you decided to leave Ecuador,
Why?
after you
Yeah.
decided to leave, how difficult was it for you and others to get permission, and how long did it take?
I think it was reasonably hard to get a visa to the United States, but if you had patience, you got it. This is what happened. My father, who had no intention of coming to the States, he was an adventurer. This is too conventional for him. Besides, he didn't speak English. Blah, 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 blah. So he, on a lark, went to the American consulate and signed up for a visa. And 4 years later, he had forgotten about it because he had no intention of using it. 4 years later, we get a postcard. It says, come and pick up your visa. So we had a family council. I was the only child, by the way. And it was clear that I was going to go. And my parents decided to stay. At that point, my father was doing better in business. Okay? So he had friends. He didn't have relatives, but he had friends. So he was comfortable there. And coming to this country at the age of, what was it, 60-something, who knows, would have been very hard for him. So I came and went back a number of times, and I was allowed to do that. It was quite gutsy of my parents, I think. So.
I have a question.
Sure.
You describe your Hagera, and it's quite interesting. But the woman here also had a Hagera, and I wonder how she got together with you, and that, frankly, is the thing that interests me the most. Could she join you?
Give her the microphone.
My. No. I don't know. Well, I had an aunt and uncle that left for the United States from Ecuador. And Elio, his parents
from Israel,
went
to Israel.
From Ecuador to Israel. And they were friends. And they got together. And the husband of my aunt died. And Elio's mother died in Israel. And they were a couple.
They became an item.
They became a couple, the two of them, which he never told his son.
I never knew.
But I knew it all the time because my aunt wrote long letters to my mother every single week. And she told her about her boyfriend, and the boyfriend told her about the son. So that's what she wrote to my mother, and she gave me to read those letters. So that's how we eventually got together.
That's a huge distance. How did you physically arrive at his birthday?
Well, there were other things, too.
I was wrapping up my career, and I could leave at times, and Edith would come to Boston. And the question was, this is an interesting question. It was obviously a problem. Would Edith come to Boston? Would I come to San Diego? And it wasn't the climate, I can tell you that. It just wasn't. But I felt that in Boston, where I had been for years and years, and I thought I knew half the city, everybody was so busy. Husband and wife had no social life. When my wife died, the phone didn't stop ringing for 2 weeks, and then it stopped ringing. And if I wanted to see my friends, I had to make an appointment. 2 weeks from now, let's see if we can get together. That didn't seem much of a life. Okay. In addition, I thought that I probably had another adventure. And in my case, the adventure has been that I became, let me call it a commentator of microbiology. I write a lot, and I enjoy that tremendously. So I don't have a lab, I don't do research, but I'm still in it, and it's just very satisfying. So I can do that just as well here, if not better. So I'm very glad I came here. Well, I guess we wrap it up.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you, Elio, and thank you all for coming. Have a good night.